Let's talk a little bit about where we're going in the next week, just so we get our plans together, next week or two. This is our second discussion of Plato's Republic. There will be one more on Plato next Tuesday. Then we will turn to Aristotle, and we'll spend a couple of days on him. Now we're continuing our discussion of Plato's Republic today. And once again, if those of you in the radio would like to read along with us as we consider this in this lecture and the next one, I'm sure your public library will have a copy of Plato's Republic. We're reading it through the allegory of the cave, which is about 2/3 of the way through the book. And then in 3 lectures from now, we will start studying Aristotle. And the book we'll read is the Ethics, and it has a complicated first name to it. It's called the Nicomachean Ethics, Nichomachean. But I think if you ask the librarian for the Ethics, you'll get the right thing, because the other ethics, the Eudaimonean Ethics, isn't quite as popular. However, if you'd like to read, if that isn't available in your library, and you'd like to read the Politics of Aristotle, it's a more difficult book, but we'll be discussing that in our class as well. Now, last time we began to consider the way Plato, this very complicated book, The Republic, which covers so many subjects, and we're just focusing on some aspects of it, those that have to do with the logic of Plato, with the philosophy of Plato in relationship to his conception of politics. As we said at the beginning of the course, every great political theorist, well, all of us for that matter, start from an image of reality and work from there to a conception of ethics, politics, and economics. And Plato did this too, but he did this in an enormously subtle way. So let's review a little bit of the first part of his analysis and of his argument, and how he goes about constructing what seems to be, at first glance, his notion of an ideal state. Now, there are many things in this argument that you may take exception to. You may not like Plato's conception of eugenics, of racial purity. You certainly might not like his idea of women and their place in the world, of his family, of the family. You may not like his whole idea of education. But try to keep in mind the overall logic of what he's saying, not all the detail that he puts on it. And if you are going to take exception to it, see where you're going to take exception to it and why you're going to take exception to it. Now, in a way, we can propositionalize, in about 5 or 6 propositions, this first part of the argument. And maybe Plato and Socrates' first proposition would be, we could put like this: society requires many different talents or virtues. And this comes from the Greek idea that there is an excellence to everything, an arete to everything, a virtue to everything. And these are not, all human activities are not one. Human activities are very diverse. And each human activity has its own virtue. Now let's call the practice of these virtues a craft. So society needs a variety of crafts. It needs farmers, it needs soldiers and administrators, it needs builders, it needs doctors, and it needs ship captains. And each craft has its peculiar excellence. We can talk of doing any one of these activities well or poorly in terms of a standard that is inherent in the activity itself. Hence, a good doctor is one who practices medicine, and we can ask, what is the end or the goal or the virtue of medicine? And we can answer health, the health of the body. Or we can talk about architecture, and we can say, what is the end of architecture? And we can say, well, function, structural integrity, harmony, and beauty, in some sense. What is the end of being a ship captain or of navigation? Well, getting from here to there without accident, on time, efficiently, and directly. Now, in a way, even at this level, Plato is talking about this abstract idea of the forms, you notice, because every craft has its form. We measure, you know, if you asked, and doctors do this all the time, if you ask the question, what is health? Any definition you'd give would be pretty inadequate and arguable. And the medical profession has never settled on an absolute definition of health that all doctors were satisfied with and knew when they were meeting it. And yet we have a sense in our mind that we know the difference between health and illness, and we know what it means to pursue good health and what it is for a doctor to try to work toward good health. And in this sense already, Plato is suggesting we're measuring a craft, we're measuring the performance of people in their work and in the world by standards that we cannot absolutely identify or put into words, but that must exist in our minds so that we can take the evaluative measure of these things, that we can say this is a good job or not such a good job. Now, in the idea of, this first postulate of Plato in the Republic, society needs a variety of talents, and a good society is one which operates on which seeks excellence, which seeks to have things done well. That we would not agree to a society in which, by intention, things were done poorly. And as I suggested last time, I don't think you'd be wildly happy about the idea that anybody who wanted to practice brain surgery just because it simply made them feel good to do so in a purely hedonistic way ought to be permitted to, or that a good society was one where everybody went around experimenting with everybody else's brains. And you'd think there was something wrong with that idea. And that to do something properly, according to the standard within it, at this point, Plato's trying to get you to agree to the proposition that that is a mark of a good society and a standard by which we should judge our economies and basically the economy and the social structure of society, and we will judge it by that standard he's suggesting to you. Now, here's this first value of Greek life: excellence, virtue, arete, and this is part of the system. Now, the second element in this, then, is that justice requires, first, that those who have a talent for a particular craft perform it, and this becomes the principle of division of labor. And then the second problem is to pull all these diverse talents together into a harmonious or a just whole. Farmers are farming, and they have to provide the cities, to provide the administrators and the businessmen with food, and the businessmen and food have to provide the markets, the commerce that gives life to the society, provides an excess for imports, that gives birth to law and administration and intellectual activities. It's the thing that we talk, it's just sort of the central proposition of economics, of any form of economy, that coordination, cooperation, trade and exchange, fitting the parts together becomes a crucial element. And for Plato, this represented the second virtue of a good society, what the Greeks called dike, harmony, balance, proportion, here expressed as a proposition of political economy, of the way society ought to be organized. Now, from this it follows that each craft should be performed according to its specialized aim, and that each craft should be, and that crafts should not mingle with one another. In other words, it wouldn't be a good idea for society to have all the people who are trained as good ship captains practicing architecture, or all the farmers doing the school teaching, or something of that kind. And here's the crucial point for modern thought, by the same token, a state that is ruled by the practitioners of one of these partial or incomplete or not total specialties would be unjust. It would be adikia. Now, for this, the argument would be as follows. Physicians should not govern. Why? Because the aim of the state is not health. You wouldn't say that just simply having a healthy society was the object of government, the object of the polis, the object of society in and of itself. It's one object, but it's not the object. And by the same token, soldiers should not rule the state, because the aim of the state is not war or even national defense. That's an aim of the state. It's an aim of society. But security alone isn't enough. It's not the total aim of society. And by the same token, businessmen should not rule the state, for the aim of the state is not profit, or you might say in more modern language, even economic growth. And this is an interesting idea, because I think very often we do evaluate government today in contemporary terms according to how well it performs its economic function. A good society is one that does not have recessions, that provides full employment, that provides economic growth, that makes people more prosperous. Now, Plato would say, we've missed the point, that that is not the aim of government, it's an aim of government. And it's only a partial aim of government. Well, what is the aim of government then? And Plato would say the answer is really quite simple. It is the harmonious blending of those talents into a good society in which each craft, each part, each function that society needs to perform is performed with excellence by those who have the skill to perform it, and each one is in balance in relation to all the rest. None moves over into the other sphere. Physicians do not meddle in politics or try to run politics, and by the same token, politicians do not try to run medicine, and so on. And in this sense, if each craft was performed by those who were expert in it or excellent in it, then society would be itself inherently just. But this means, for Plato, that those who rule, those who govern, must also be specialists. Because he argues each person with his own talent is just a judge of the part. He or she is not a judge of the whole. We can make a lot of mistakes. I'm a professor, and I may tend to judge political events by how they contribute to the life of the mind. And that may not be a good idea, because the life of the mind isn't everything, isn't the only thing for society. And by the same token, a businessman shouldn't be the only judge of political affairs, or isn't even a very good one, because he keeps thinking about how the books balance, whether things are working out profitably, whether government spending too much money can't pay its debts. He's worried about deficits and taxes and things like that. And while that's an important aim, it's a biased aim. It's a partial aim. Each of the talents, each of the virtues we bring biases our judgment, and hence we can't really create justice in the state. So the rulers must be specialists in justice itself. And what they must do is to create a harmonious whole from the manifestations of justice that appear in all the different talents. So that, in a sense, every talent is part of universal justice. And I think you know that. I mean, you sense when you watch a really good carpenter, a really good automobile mechanic at work, that there is something in what they're doing that's a little like a symphony, or it's a little like a masterpiece of art. And you know it isn't just a craft. And when you watch somebody really running a business smoothly and efficiently and serving the consumer well, you get a sense for a harmony and a manifestation of something that's not unlike art, and it's not unlike science, and it's not unlike the skill of something like medicine. So in each art, in each craft, there is an internal sense of justice. But none of these is complete justice. Now, the ruler who understands justice by these manifestations appreciates all these other arts, but appreciates also how they fit together. So the guardians, in effect, must be able to get on top of the problem, as we say in modern society. They can't be so immersed in any one of these manifestations of justice that they are biased by it. They must look for the harmony of the whole, the completeness of the whole. And that requires a special education to guide them to this talent for harmonizing diverse specialties and toward impartiality. And when you then go on to read Plato's description of the education of the guardians and their lifestyle, you see what this requires. The knowledge of justice itself requires what we would call, I guess, in integrated liberal studies, a liberal arts education, an appreciation of goodness in a wide variety of fields. It's not a specialized education. It's picking up the best everywhere and seeing it all in relationship to one thing and another. So as you notice, the guardian studies physical education, he studies religion, he studies music, and in all of those things, what you're trying to do is to introduce the guardian class to the intimations of justice in a variety of forms. Now, you don't have to do that with a ship captain. You teach a ship captain navigation, it's rather pointless to teach the ship captain music, by Plato's standard. We might disagree with that in modern terms. And curiously, I suppose, even a program of liberal education like integrated liberal studies was intended as an education for leaders. and frankly, does follow a little bit of the old Platonic model in its design, in its conception, in what we're trying to do. There's a sense that a very immodest sense, this is education for the guardians rather than for the specialists, even though I don't think we really believe that at this point in time. So the education is one thing, the other is impartiality. The guardians have to be set apart from society, and you do this by the arrangements for communal living. No private wives, no private family, no private property, nothing that can bind your interests to anything other than the welfare, not of society, but the doing of justice itself. Important distinction there. The object of the guardian is not simply the good of society, not to do the will of the people, not to do what's best for Athens or America. The duty and the responsibility of the guardian is to justice. And through justice, he does his duty to his society, and by doing justice, he does his duty to society and to the people. Now, along the line, Plato introduces, the mood changes suddenly in this discussion, and Plato introduces another discussion which is called the myth of the metals. And this just pops out of the page at you, and you wonder what it's doing there. And he somehow loses this logical or descriptive sense and begins to create this fable, this fairy tale, this myth, how all people are divided into gold or silver or bronze. And this gets layered with folklore and legend and other very odd beliefs. And one wonders what that is doing in the middle of the argument for a while, until one realizes that what Plato is saying, I think, is that if you did set up such a state of the guardians, the people wouldn't accept it. Because the people, again, have their partial biases. The businessman thinks the government should be run by good businessmen, not these starry-eyed guardians. And the carpenter thinks, by golly, it's people who know how to make straight buildings, and all these guardians are going around making oval-shaped gardens, and that's a terrible thing to do. And so these people are going to resist the knowledge of the guardian because they have their specialized point of view. So you have to teach, so there's another educational function involved. You have to teach the people a noble lie. You have to teach them a belief system, a mythology. And remember, Athens at this point is still not too far distant from the age of Homer. There's a mixture of rationalism and religion, as America isn't so far away from mythological age. We too believe that our value system is founded on a mixture of religion and rationality. And so when you think of Plato's myth of the metals, in a way all he's doing is saying the same thing an American might say. It's saying, no matter how rational your government is, make sure it has a religious foundation. And if you ask the question, well, is that rational foundation is that religious foundation scientific? Is it rational? You might say no. And then some people, but not all, would say, but it's helpful. Because it teaches people to respect the law, it teaches people to obey the customs of the country, it teaches people values who might not understand the higher logic of the law. And if you can agree with that proposition, or if you've heard that said in the name of religion in America today, then you're understanding a little of what Plato meant by the myth of the metals. That you teach the people something other than the truth about the foundations of their society, because the people themselves don't know justice. And in the interest of creating a just society, then, you have to fabricate a myth or a tradition or an idea of that society that isn't quite true. Now, about this point, Plato and Socrates seem to complete what many people historically have taken as Plato's ideal state. And many of you have looked at it and just a shiver's gone down your spine and said, this is a totalitarian society. Plato is some kind of a fascist. What's going on here? Well, how has this come down to history as something so important and so lovely for us to admire? But at this point, right after the Utopia is completed, Socrates, Plato, informs us that we have not found out what justice is yet. Because the whole book, after all, is an inquiry into what justice is. And in a way, we haven't yet defined the ideal constitution. Because remember, even the guardians don't know what justice is. All that they know are the appearances of justice that are manifest in various arts, crafts, and human activities. Only, Plato says, the philosopher truly knows what justice is. And then, on page 177 of your book, after all of this, after 3 nights of talk, after 177 pages of your reading and trying to remember all of this, Plato asserts that we have neither found out what justice is or the good society is yet, because he says, unless philosophers become kings, or those who are now called kings come to be instilled with a genuine desire for wisdom, unless political power and philosophy meet, there can be no help from our troubles. Well, where do we go from here? Now, this is a fascinating proposition. Who should rule? Not the guardians, not the specialists in justice. Philosophers should rule. Now, this idea, when you think of it in your 20th century guys, is not a terribly attractive one, especially if you've met philosophers. Yeah, you think about it, I mean, I guess really, I think I'd rather be governed by the first dozen names out of the Madison phone book than the entire philosophy department of the University of Wisconsin. And I don't know quite what that means, but I think, again, it's one of these problems of translation where we begin to misunderstand Plato so entirely. Just as if you think about justice without realizing the larger connotations for the Greek mind. If you think about that, that constant reflection of the word virtue, which sounds so prissy to you, without thinking that that word really means arete and excellence and the sense, the inner purpose or the end or the object of a craft or any human undertaking. Well, we found there are a lot of places that you can understand these wonderful Victorian translations of Plato. And the other place, I think, is in this notion of a philosopher. Because we think of a philosopher as someone who specializes in theory, or if we want to be honest about it and generous about it, in rationality. You think of a philosopher as someone who is very rational about things, very logical. And in a way, if you read Plato the way we're beginning, we're tempted to read him, it almost sounds like he's saying government should be logical. Government should be rational. You can almost substitute and say mathematicians should rule or logicians should rule. And somehow you're tempted by something here. Economists, heaven knows these days, are tempted by it, and others are tempted by it, which is a very modern view of what Plato meant. And this idea of philosophy and this idea that wisdom should be rational in the sense of mathematical, sure, there's an underlying Pythagorean theme in everything we're talking about here, but this is a very modern conception and has nothing to do with the way the Greeks actually probably saw it. Because once again, to understand Plato's idea of a philosopher, we have to go back and understand his response to the Greek problem of illusion and reality, the doctrine of the forms that we discussed briefly last time. And his way of responding as dramatically as he did to this proposition, this question that the pre-Socratic philosophers put up and that changed the course of all Western inquiry. Everything we see around us could be illusion, it could be different. Everything we see around us is not necessary. What then is the reality behind appearances? And in answering that question, Plato is driving toward the conception of good government. Good government should be founded on reality, not illusion. And the whole work of the world should be. And in this way, he's also answering that timeless question that everybody's asked about society. What is the order of the universe? And then what follows from the order of the universe for the order of human and social affairs? We saw how the Mesopotamians answered that question, the Egyptians, the ancient Hebrews. We saw the attempts of others to answer it, how the Periclean age thought about that. And now we see Plato's very distinctive answer to it and what he means by the idea that the philosopher should rule. Well, once again, let's review his idea, the fundamental idea behind the Platonic forms. What we see, the world of appearance around us, the transitory world, that from the Greek point of view is just illusion, is always changing, is always in flux, and therefore is not permanent. These things are images, just images, that's all. If we look at something and we say, that's a square, for example, and then we look at it again and say, but that's not a very good square. It's not really an accurate square. A perfect square wouldn't be lopsided and have little jingles in it. But how do we know it's a square at all? How does something pop out of the world? Can you do this just for a moment? Can you sort of just close your eyes and kind of open them and think of what the world, or just kind of maybe just blur your eyes so that you can't see distinctive visions. If you're nearsighted, this is a real easy trick. And you cannot distinguish separate objects. Well, now if you open your eyes fully or put on your glasses and you see separate objects, you make distinctions. That's a person. That's a blouse. That's a chair. Well, why is that not a person, blouse, chair? You know, why don't all the three things go together? How do you take the particular cutout of reality that you do unless there's something telling you to identify person versus chair as the essential distinction that you're supposed to make? Now, over and over and over again, Socrates and Plato try to persuade you that ultimate reality has to be that way. It has to be founded on this idea in the mind. For us to even think of this thing, this object, as a square, we have to have an idea of a square that exists previously in the mind. And furthermore, there's an idea of excellence. It's not just scientific. It's not just the way we identify things. It's also moral in a strange way, because we say good and bad about those things. We say that isn't a very good square, for example. So we evaluate by the form. To put it another way, all knowledge is a matter of comparison between an ideal and a reality, between the ideal and the things that appear to our senses, rather. Take a harder case, for example. What happens if I put the question to you, is this class a community? Now, we could go off and we could argue about that for an hour, and you'd say, no, I don't think it's a community. And we'd say, why not? Why isn't this class a community? And you'd say, well, we don't know each other. And I'd say, do any group of people who know each other, everybody knows their names, is that a community? And you'd say, well, I'll have to think about that for a moment. No, they have to have a common purpose. Any group that knows each other and has a common purpose is a community. Well, you're not quite sure, but each time a definition is tried, what are you doing? And you're trying to accept the definition. You're comparing that definition with what? With what? With the city of Madison? You're thinking, the city of Madison is indeed a community. I will compare this with it. With Rhinelander or Hayward, Wisconsin, where you grew up? No, I don't think so. That's not an ideal community. With Athens in the 4th century, with 100,000 slaves? No, that isn't your ideal of community. Where is this thing that you're comparing all these definitions of community with to make up your mind to the simple, everyday, obvious question, is this class a community? Now, if you can't show it to me, if it's not here in the physical world, where is it? And where did you read about it? And since you're not talking about community anymore, we're saying, how do you define community? It is a group of people who know each other and have a common purpose. And you say, well, I've got to think about that. I'm not quite sure that's still a sufficient definition of a community. How do you know it isn't sufficient yet? What is it you're still going to think about, for heaven's sake, if not Rhinelander or Athens or this class or the city of Madison or the New England town meeting or something of that kind? Okay, Plato's trying to tell you that's in your mind. There's an image of the community that you're working on as you give these abstract definitions. There's an image of the community right on down the line. Now, Plato says that we not only do this with words like community, words like horse, words like lamppost, but with values. We can ask the question, what is beauty? We can ask the question, what is justice? In just exactly the same way. And we are always comparing our ideas of justice with some image, some form that must exist in the mind. For there to be an unjust act, there must be a standard of comparison. And if I say, for example, giving the example we've used several times, take another example. I say, from now on, we're going to meet in discussion sections differently. All the men are going to be in one discussion all the men are going to be in separate discussion sections. We're going to put all the women in one discussion section because they're not worth much after all. And we'll just have one discussion section about 80 people for women, and then the men will be in groups of 10. And I just can feel it, out there. That's unjust. I say, well, why is it unjust? And somebody will tell me, well, that's discrimination. And I'll say, what's wrong with discrimination? And you'll say, well, you're treating people arbitrarily. And I'm saying, now why is arbitrariness unjust? We discriminate in all kinds of ways between people, and we do it fairly arbitrarily. For example, we discriminate between the intelligent and the dumb. Not everybody got into the University of Wisconsin. Why, if we can leave dumb people out, why can't we leave women out? What's the difference between discriminating on the grounds of intelligence and discriminating on the grounds of sex? They're both inborn traits you can't do anything about. Seems just as relevant to do it one way or another. And you're thinking, aren't you? You're beginning to worry a little bit about that proposition. And you're already wondering whether maybe our society, the learned value, everybody should have an equal opportunity to prove their talents. Well, wait a minute, you didn't deserve your talents. You didn't earn your talents. They were born in you, like being female or being black or being Oriental or being American Indian. So why should we treat smart people any differently than poor people? But we do in this society. You make a whole lot more money, get a whole lot more honor, get to go to nice places like the University of Wisconsin. Now already you're saying, wait a minute, maybe that is unfair, and it's not just a consistency test. Think about how you're doing it, what's going on. Is there maybe what standard? What standard are you comparing it against so that this argument makes any sense at all to you? Okay, now this is Plato. And Plato goes through and says, look, you've got 3 levels of knowledge that we're dealing with in everything. On the everyday level, we make judgments in terms of opinion, doxa, orthodoxy. And what we do is we trade ideas simply on the basis of cliches, like Cephalus and Polymachus and Thrasymachus' definitions of justice, or our own cliches. Sex discrimination, sex discrimination is bad because it's discriminatory, or something like that. And why is it a bad thing? Well, everybody says it's a bad thing. All right, what we have here is illusion. These are the things that may pass. We didn't always think sex discrimination was a bad thing in this country. Until the last 30, 40, 50 years, we thought it was just a Jim Dandy thing in this country. Now we've changed our mind. Now what might we think next week? And that's a pretty frightening thought. We may change all of our values, all of our ideals. They've changed in the past. The world is changing, like the river. And maybe we can't count on things being the same. And this made the Greeks unnerved. And if you think about it long enough, it's going to unnerve you considerably too. But this is the first level, opinion. And that's all we have to work with most of the time. Now we can go beyond it, Plato and Socrates tell us, to the level of reflective knowledge by asking questions, engaging in the reasoning together, engaging in the Socratic dialogue. Discrimination is a bad thing, we might argue, when it is arbitrary. When we say sex discrimination is bad, we're saying it's bad because sex is an arbitrary differentiator. A good discrimination is based, we might argue to one another, on a relevant criterion. If intelligence or if sex has something to do with the question at hand, by which we're separating people, such as college admissions or having babies or something of that kind, then we would not say it's unjust to discriminate. But it's only when it's used arbitrarily or irrelevantly to the purpose at hand. Ah, you say, that's a smart distinction. That's very interesting. But Plato would say that's okay. It's a definition. You've reasoned to something, but it's only halfway home because this is a formal, logical, rational definition of an idea of justice, but it is not the idea. It is not the form of justice itself. You are able to make that definition simply because you knew the form in the first place and could say this definition tends to hit the form. So what is the form? Well, the form is an immediate apprehension. It is the sudden encounter with the idea of justice itself. It is knowledge of the permanent idea of justice behind all the events, all the examples, all the instances, all the manifestations in the world. I can't show you justice. Maybe I can give you an idea of a form if you'll let me play with beauty. I can take you out of an evening on a northern lake, somewhere in the Quetico, where all is quiet. I can show you a sunset, and I don't have to tell you it's beautiful, and I can't define beauty for you. There is only one word for it, and it is G. And you have apprehended beauty in and of itself. It is not a definition, and giving a definition would be irrelevant. Now, if that will count for beauty, then Plato is saying all the definitions we give to justice are not the same as that apprehension of justice itself. Now, let's return to the idea of the philosopher king. Truth and politics. Only those who understand, Plato is telling us about at the end of the construction of the State of the Guardians, only those who perceive and know the forms should rule. Only they can lead the just state, and only they know what true justice is. See, that is reality. The reality is not the definition. The reality is not the logic. This is why our word, the philosopher king, is so bad. It's not rational. It's not a definition. It's not an axiom. It's the immediate apprehension of the forms. And so the word philosopher doesn't fit. What Plato is after is saying the person who should rule is the person who knows justice itself, not the one who's thought about it, not the one who's reasoned to a system of justice, but the one who's seen it. Well, now we can see more clearly what Plato means by the ideal ruler, but think about the ideas that we've heard so far and ask yourself, where else have you heard them? Now, think of what Plato's taught. Harmony, balance, a sense of oneness is essential to the good life and the good society. Reality is an illusion. There is a truth behind appearances and the things of this world. Enlightenment comes from understanding the wholeness or the oneness of things. The essence of truth is inexpressible. It can't be said in words. The teachers of wisdom, those who have been to the mountain, must speak in parables because true wisdom is direct experience. Now, if you've heard this before, you can see that these are words you hear that are religious, not rational. This is Oriental mysticism. There's a bit of Zen in here. There's a bit of Buddhism. There's all the great religious traditions of the world speak in about the same way. The truth is inexpressible. The truth is one. There's a wholeness to experience. And now we see a little dimension of Plato that is lost in that word philosopher king. For the philosopher king is not the lover of reason, or the lover of wisdom, as we might say in the modern world, but rather he begins to look more like the prophet, the Buddha, the mystic, or the Christ figure. So when Plato says philosophers are those who apprehend the eternal and the unchanging, and when Plato says there will be no end of our troubles until philosophers rule, what he's really saying is there will be no end of our troubles until mystics rule in some way. Now this takes us to the allegory of the cave, which is Plato's next and kind of culminating expression of all of this. And he sets up a picture because he too must speak in parables to make his message come across. And it's hard to tell from the text, but to express it gently, you can picture what Plato has in mind. He contrives this scene where a group of prisoners are chained by chains in a deep cave in such a way that they can only see straight ahead, and they can't move, and they can't get up, and they're just living there. They were born there, they were brought up that way, they've been there more or less forever. And it's very dark in the cave, and all at once, for reasons of their own, a group of people start showing shadow pictures of the kind, sometimes you've done that. You take a slide projector and a screen and you start making duck pictures with your fingers and things like that. Well, the sun's outside the cave and it's shining into the cave and it shines on the back wall, which is sort of like a movie screen. And all at once, these prisoners, who by now are totally bored sitting there in this position, start seeing shadows flickering across the back wall of the cave, and they began talking about them. And pretty soon they begin to say, the figures begin to appear over and over again, and they begin to see this figure over and over again that has kind of long, funny ears. And they begin to say, there it goes again. Yep. Saw that at 2 o'clock yesterday. Yeah. One says, I think, why don't we, we'll see that again. That's a rabbit. Well, that's a good name for it. And the next time it comes, they say, that's a rabbit. And they keep looking at this thing, and then they begin to have this game. They begin to name all the things they see, and they say, that's a mixmaster. That's a pelican. Various things begin to appear before them, and they begin, that's an in-joke, yes. They see these things appearing before them on the screen, and they go by, and they create a whole language, but more importantly, they create a whole universe. Everything they know about the universe is what they've seen there. Now, all at once, one of the prisoners breaks his chains and walks out into the sunlight. Now, incidentally, just sort of a passing thought here. Sun worship is going to be a theme we're going to see. We saw it back in Egypt. We're going to see it again with Copernicus in the 1500s. But watch the motive force behind reality in Plato. It's the sun. It's kind of fascinating. And all at once you look into the sun, and the one person who escapes is blinded for an instant. And he sees reality, and it's so strange, and it's so startling, and it's, the colors are vibrant, and the brightness just hurts his eyes. And he's tempted to run back into the cave. But finally he turns around and walks out, and he begins to see things as they are. And he begins to see this little funny furry thing with long ears, and he says, hey, that's a real rabbit. And this is a real pelican over here, and that's a real mixmaster, and you've got all of these things out here. And he says, look, they're colored, and they have sharp delineations, and they're not these things, they're not as the forms are now. And he runs back into the cave, and he tells the people, hey, you've been deluded. That's wrong. What you're seeing on the walls is just false. And the world isn't that way at all. And he tries to persuade the prisoners that what they see is not truth. And they laugh at them. And he says, look, you tell me about this furry thing that's white and wiggles its nose, and tell me that's a rabbit. That isn't a rabbit. A rabbit is that fuzzy thing that, kind of goes across the screen back there. And you tell me this thing is a mixmaster. That isn't a mixmaster. A mixmaster is that shape up there. You're crazy, man. It has nothing to do with reality at all, what you're talking about. Now, the person who's gone out into the light, the philosopher king, the mystic king, comes back. And he now tries to release the people and lead them out and say, look, this is crazy. He's so intent on showing them how the world really is. And they say, no, we're not going with you. But he keeps trying to force them. And finally, they kill him. Now, what's Plato's message at this point then? Only if the mystic becomes king can there be a truly just society. But if the mystic tries to rule, the people whose common sense understands only appearances, not the truth, will scorn him, defy him, and eventually put him to death. As they killed Socrates, as 400 years later they would kill Christ, as throughout history they would kill, so Plato would suggest, long before the event, everyone who understood the truth. Now, from this, what does Plato's political message become? Well, is it that the first message we got out of him, that the guardians who are educated in the craft of justice should rule? That's one message that people have taken through the centuries from Plato, that you need a specially educated class who knows the craft of politics. This is the sense in which Plato is sometimes called the father of modern totalitarianism. Or is Plato's message that the mystic, the philosopher king, the one who has been to the mountain, the Buddha, the person who truly knows justice, should rule? Perhaps that's Plato's message. Or after you get to the allegory of the cave, and that is the message you might take away. If you take the first message away, that the guardian should rule, that's the message you would take away from Plato's construction of the ideal society. The second message comes out of Plato's conception of the forms, that the philosopher king, the mystic king, the person who truly knows reality behind opinion and even behind rationality, behind reflective reason should rule. But the third possibility appears out of the allegory of the cave, that government can never be based on true justice, on reality, on the order of the universe, and therefore politics is ultimately a tragedy, because we have the forms in our mind, an intimation of them, a suspicion of them, but we can never be satisfied with any government, and we all live in the cave, and politics will always be conducted in the cave and will never reflect reality. So one way of reading Plato, and I admit that what I've told you today is merely one man's interpretation. There are hundreds and thousands of interpretations of Plato, and you don't have to copy it all down. I'm not teaching you the truth, just one way of looking at it. Plato has taken you up the mountain and he's taken you down again. And all the questions still are there for us to examine. First, is politics a craft? That's the first metaphor he uses. Is it more than opinion or a struggle for power? Are some policies really better and juster and more desirable from the point of view of the people than others? Then, is there a higher truth than opinion or even rational definition that is vaguely reflected in our moral sensitivities? Has Plato persuaded you that there are, in some way, absolutes of right and wrong that exist in the mind? Then the third question is, can true justice be realized in the world? Or given that humankind is condemned to live in darkness, is the philosopher king an impossibility? And if the third is the case, how then do we understand the problem of government and the economy and human affairs if it can't be based on reality, if it can't be based on science, if it can't be based on an understanding of the nature of the universe and human beings? Now that's the question, the ultimate question, I guess, in some ways, that Plato leaves you with, and we'll examine that one next time.